The restaurant glowed like a snow globe, cracked open in the middle of the city, every window filled with reflections of Christmas lights, polished cutlery, and laughing faces. Warm music floated above the murmur of voices, bells, and soft carols weaving together into something that sounded, from the outside, like pure happiness. Camilla moved through that golden world with a tray balanced on her shoulder, her red shirt perfectly tucked, black apron tied in a tight knot at her waist, the muscles of her body doing what her mind was too tired to think about anymore. The air was thick with the smell of roast turkey, butter, perfume, and spilled wine, heavy enough to cling to her skin and hair. Near the huge Christmas tree, a little girl posed for a picture, and for a heartbeat, Camilla didn't see the restaurant at all. She saw a tiny artificial tree in her apartment, decorated with paper stars that Sophia had colored by hand. Her feet ached inside worn black shoes that had long ago stopped pretending to be comfortable, each step sending a dull pulse of pain up her legs, but she kept the same gentle smile on her face. "Feliz Natal," she said again and again, the words leaving her lips almost by themselves as she refilled glasses and set down plates that cost more than her weekly groceries. Tonight was supposed to be the night that would save her month, the one with extra hours and generous tips, the night she had quietly promised herself would pay for at least part of Sophia's next hospital bill. Every time she slipped the check into the small leather folder, she pictured not numbers, but her daughter's thin wrists under white hospital sheets, the monitor lights blinking like tiny, impatient Christmas lights. Hope, she knew, was a fragile thing to carry in a place like this, but she carried it anyway, balanced as carefully as any tray. The illusion cracked with a single word when the manager called her name, his voice cutting through the music with the same sharpness as a dropped glass. He stood by the service station, holding a receipt between two fingers, as if it were something dirty, accusing her of forgetting to ring in an appetizer and costing the restaurant money. Around them, the other servers slowed without stopping, eyes drifting toward the scene and then away again, that quick, guilty look people have when they pass by an accident and pretend not to see. The song playing over the speakers talked about peace on earth and goodwill toward men, but to Camilla it sounded far away now, like it belonged to another room, another life. She tried to explain that the order had come in wrong, that she had fixed it as soon as she noticed, but her voice felt small and thin next to his. "People would kill for this job," he murmured, leaning in just close enough for the words to be private and the humiliation to be public. He reminded her how easy it would be to cut her hours, to give her shifts to someone less dramatic, someone who wouldn't bring their personal life into his restaurant. And the phrase lodged in her chest like a stone. A couple at the window burst into laughter at some joke, their glasses touching in a soft, musical chime that sounded to her like the final little crack in a porcelain plate. The promise she had made that morning, telling Sophia that this Christmas would be better, that mamma tina un plano, suddenly felt like a lie she had told a child who trusted too easily. Camilla swallowed, nodded, apologized for a mistake she wasn't sure she had made, and felt the heat rise behind her eyes in a way she could no longer push down. She turned away before he could see the first tear, heading for the entrance under the pretense of straightening the silverware on an empty table by the door, desperate for a breath of colder air. The restaurant's warm glow blurred at the edges as her vision misted, the lights of the tree stretching into thin streaks of red and gold, like someone had dragged a wet brush across a painting. She pressed the back of her hand to her cheek, angry at herself for breaking, angry at a world where one bad schedule change could decide whether a child got a surgery or not. In the glass door, her reflection stared back at her, a young woman in a red uniform that made her look like part of the decorations, a name tag pinned above a heart carrying far more than her paycheck suggested. Then the automatic door slid open with a soft hiss, letting in a breath of winter, and at that exact moment her shoulders shook, the quiet sob she had tried to swallow escaping into the space between one heartbeat and the next. A man stepped through the doorway and nearly collided with her, the cold still clinging to his grey sweater, the scent of outside air cutting through the heavy warmth of the restaurant. He stopped short, eyes catching on the tear tracks on her face, on the way she tried to pull herself together, dragging the corners of her mouth into a smile that never made it past her lips. For a second, the noise around them dimmed, as if someone had turned down the volume of the whole night, leaving only her uneven breathing and his startled silence suspended in the light of the doorway. To anyone watching, he was just another customer arriving late to a festive dinner. Jeans, a simple watch, an expression that could be read as concern or simple surprise. But this was Daniel, the unseen owner of every wreath, every polished fork, every shift on that schedule, and as he looked at the crying waitress in his family-style restaurant, something in the story he told himself about his success began, quietly, to come undone. For a heartbeat after the near collision at the door, Camilla stood frozen, caught between apology and escape, one hand still hovering uselessly near the cutlery she was supposed to be straightening. The man in the grey sweater murmured a soft, "I'm sorry," even though he was the one who had almost bumped into her, and that small reversal of blame made her throat tighten even more. She forced her eyes down, focusing on a fork slightly askew, willing herself to become just hands and tasks again instead of a person with a face wet from tears. Behind them, the restaurant hummed on, oblivious, a world of clinking glasses and private jokes where her pain was just background noise, if it was anything at all. When the manager's voice barked her name from across the room, the moment shattered, and she slipped away from the doorway like a shadow returning to its place. Daniel watched her retreat toward the service station, noticing the way her shoulders straightened in stages, as if she was rebuilding the armor while she walked. He moved deeper into the restaurant and chose a table in the corner, the kind usually reserved for customers who wanted privacy, and sat down with his back to the wall so he could see the entire floor. From here, the polished version of his brand stretched out in front of him. The tree, the smiling photos on the wall, the carefully chosen color scheme designed to say home and family in every frame. For years, he had believed those choices meant something, that this place really did offer warmth and belonging to anyone who walked in. Tonight, the crack in that belief sat in a red uniform and carried a tray through the crowd, pretending nothing had happened. A hostess appeared at his table with menus and a rehearsed smile, asking if he was meeting anyone or dining alone, and he answered automatically, his voice sounding distant even to himself. As she walked away, he glanced at the holiday slogan printed on the cover of the menu, some cheerful line about where everyone is treated like family, and felt a faint, bitter taste rise in the back of his throat. Numbers flashed in his mind. Labor costs, turnover rates, client satisfaction scores, all the metrics he had reviewed in meetings where people used words like optimized and streamlined as if they were synonyms for good. None of those charts had a column for the way that young woman had tried to swallow her sobs at the door. For the first time in a long time, he wondered what, exactly, his success had been built on. When Camilla came to his table, her smile was back in place, neat and practiced, but her eyes were still faintly swollen, the skin beneath them just a little darker than the soft makeup could hide. Her voice did not tremble, and her hands did not shake, as she set down a glass of water and told him the specials. Yet there was a careful distance in the way she spoke, like someone walking across a frozen lake, testing each step. He listened more to the spaces between her words than to the words themselves, the little pauses where a different version of the night might have spilled out if anyone had ever asked how she was. Instead, she wrote his order on a small pad, thanked him with the same line she used for everyone, and turned quickly away when he said, "Thank you, Camilla," using her name as if it belonged in a more gentle sentence. As she moved on, Daniel leaned back in his chair and let his eyes travel around the room, seeing details he had never really looked at before. The tired busboy rubbing his wrists near the dish station, the cook peeking out from the kitchen with a face shiny from heat and stress, the hostess quietly massaging her temples when she thought no one was watching. The entire place was wrapped in the costume of celebration, but underneath he could feel the hum of something tighter, more strained, like a rubber band stretched too far. The music floated on, the lights blinked, the trees sparkled, and the manager's laugh boomed from somewhere near the bar as he charmed a table of big spenders. Yet for Daniel, the glow had shifted, exposing shadows he had never bothered to look into. In the silence between each clink of glass and each shouted "Merry Christmas," a question began to form, heavy and unwelcome. If this is what my family looks like when I'm not supposed to be here, what else have I refused to see? At the beginning of December, before the restaurant filled with flashing lights and plastic holly, mornings in Camilla's apartment began in a much quieter way, with the soft wheeze of the old radiator and the tiny, determined cough of Sophia waking up in the next room. The place was small enough that Camilla could hear every sound without leaving her thin mattress, but for a few seconds, between sleep and reality, she would pretend it was a different apartment, with thicker walls and warmer floors, and a Christmas tree that didn't come in a cardboard box. Then Sophia would call "Mamãe" in that sleepy voice of hers, and the day would begin for real, pulling Camilla up and out of bed like a string tied straight to her heart. She would pad across the cold floor, wrap her daughter in a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent and hospital waiting rooms, and kiss her forehead the way the nurses had taught her, silently checking for fever. Only when Sophia smiled, thin but bright, did Camilla allow herself to breathe. The tree in the corner of the living room was more imagination than decoration, a skinny thing they had bought on clearance 2 years earlier, its plastic branches bent in odd directions, still shedding fake needles no matter how gently Camilla handled it. But under Sophia's hands, it became something else entirely, a castle of light, a magic forest, a promise. One afternoon, while Camilla hurried to get ready for another double shift, the little girl had sat at the table with scissors and colored paper, cutting out uneven stars and hearts with the fierce concentration only children and surgeons seem to have. By the time Camilla came out of the bathroom, still towel-drying her hair, the window was covered in those shapes, taped crookedly but proudly, a galaxy of crinkled hope. "So the good things can find us," Sophia had explained, touching one of the stars, and Camilla had laughed and cried at the same time, hugging her so tight the child squeaked. It was because of those stars that Camilla said yes to every extra shift, even when her body begged her to say no. She took the closing shifts that nobody wanted, came in early to roll silverware and wipe down menus, stayed late to vacuum corners and stack chairs, always with the same phrase in her head: "Cada hora é pedacinho da cirurgia." Each hour was a tiny piece of that hospital bill, a little more medicine, another test, one less thing to fear when the doctor walked in with a clipboard. At the restaurant, she learned to swallow comments that stung, to laugh at jokes that were not funny, to ignore the way her tips sometimes seemed lighter than the night deserved, because arguing meant being noticed, and being noticed meant risking the hours she was chasing. At home, she counted crumpled bills on the kitchen table while Sophia slept in the next room, the light from the fridge spilling over piles of coins and receipts as if they were relics in some quiet church. The letter from the hospital came on a Tuesday, folded neatly in an envelope that looked no different from a phone bill or a coupon flyer, sitting on the mat outside the door when Camilla came back from a morning shift. She read it standing right there in the hallway, keys still in her hand, the words blurring and sharpening as if someone were adjusting a lens on her life. Payment required, up front. Insurance not covering the procedure. Deadlines that sounded more like ultimatums than dates. For a long moment, she simply stared at the page, hearing nothing but the distant hum of a neighbor's TV and the faint rattle of Sophia's cough through the thin wall, and then, very carefully, she folded the letter again and slipped it into her bag. Inside the apartment, she smiled as if nothing had changed, kissed her daughter's hair, heated up soup, and joked about the silly Christmas movie playing on their tiny screen, because if she let the fear out in front of Sophia, she knew it would never go back inside. That night, after Sophia finally fell asleep with one hand resting on the paper star taped above her bed, Camilla sat alone at the kitchen table with the lights off, the only brightness coming from the street lamp outside and the blinking red eye of the microwave clock. The letter lay unfolded in front of her, its words now etched into her mind so deeply she didn't need to read them anymore, but she kept smoothing the creases as if that might soften what they meant. She tried to imagine where else money could come from, extra shifts, a second job, selling the old TV, pawning the cheap necklace her mother had given her years ago, adding and subtracting numbers that never quite reached the total she needed. The future narrowed to a thin, sharp line. Either she found a way, or Sophia's surgery would be delayed, and the thought of delayed curled inside her like ice. When she finally went to bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, one promise looped in her head like a prayer she did not entirely believe. This Christmas somehow, for Sophia, she would make it different, even if she had no idea how. Hours before he walked into Camilla's restaurant, Daniel had been standing in a very different kind of light, the kind that bounced off crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes instead of plastic wreaths and laminated menus. The corporate Christmas party was in full swing on the 25th floor of a glass tower, a ballroom filled with dark suits, glittering dresses, and the low rumble of practiced laughter. Executives patted him on the back as they handed him printed reports and sleek tablets, tapping numbers with manicured fingers, while words like record efficiency, optimized margins, and historic profitability circled the room like well-trained birds. On the big screen at the front, a slideshow of smiling employees in company shirts flashed by, each photo carefully chosen to say, "We are a family, and the family is thriving." Daniel lifted his glass when someone proposed a toast in his honor, but the bubbles tasted flat in his mouth, and for reasons he couldn't quite name, he felt like a guest at a party held for a stranger. When the speeches ended, he drifted toward the window, looking down at the city as snow began to trace faint lines across the dark, like someone shaking sugar over a vast cold cake. Clusters of light marked neighborhoods, where his restaurants sat on busy corners, their signs glowing like familiar signatures he had once been proud to see. Somewhere under those roofs, people were working double shifts, ringing up checks, sweeping floors, wearing the uniforms that bore his name. "Our teams are happy," one executive had said earlier, pointing to a satisfaction graph that sloped upward in a perfect, reassuring line. "Our managers are keeping labor tight. They're heroes out there." The phrase lodged in Daniel's mind and refused to leave, echoing uncomfortably against his own memory of years waiting tables, burning his hands on plates and walking home with sore feet and a pocket full of singles. The idea came to him not as a grand plan, but as a quiet, insistent tug. Go see for yourself. He slipped away from the main cluster of guests, loosening his tie as he walked down the hallway, ignoring the calls inviting him back for another photo, another joke. In the elevator, he watched his reflection in the mirrored walls. Perfectly cut suit, smooth hair, the measured face of a man used to being listened to. and for a moment he hardly recognized the kid who once counted tips in a dark apartment kitchen just to see if rent might be possible. By the time the doors opened at the parking level, he had already decided to leave the chauffeur out of this, to drive himself for once, to show up at one of his locations the way any other man might on Christmas Eve, alone, dressed down, anonymous. He tossed the tie onto the passenger seat, shrugged off his jacket, and pulled a worn grey sweater from the back seat, one of the few things he still owned from the days before custom tailoring. There was, tucked somewhere under all his justifications, a childish curiosity he didn't completely admit to himself. He wanted to see his own myth in action. This particular restaurant had been praised over and over in reports for its exceptional managerial performance, its outstanding cost control, the kind of phrases that translated neatly into end-of-year bonuses and upward-facing arrows on the charts. In Daniel's mind, that had always meant the manager was organized, efficient, maybe even beloved by the staff. Someone who could make a busy night run like a well-rehearsed play. As he drove through the city streets, wipers pushing soft flakes aside, he imagined walking into a warm, bustling room, being greeted by a team that, despite the rush, still had enough energy left to laugh, to joke, to embody that family atmosphere every marketing campaign promised. It would be, he told himself, a reassuring little experiment, a way to quiet the vague unease that sometimes stirred when the numbers looked too good. By the time he parked a block away and stepped out into the cold, the wind cutting through his sweater, the restaurant's sign was already visible up ahead, glowing cheerfully against the night. He pulled his hands into his pockets, not wanting anyone to recognize the expensive watch at his wrist, and walked toward the bright windows, where silhouettes moved gracefully between tables under the watchful shine of a giant Christmas tree. From the sidewalk, it looked exactly like the kind of place he had always wanted to build, warm, welcoming, full of life. He paused for a second outside the door, telling himself this was just a quick check-in, a quiet way of patting his own creation on the back. Then the automatic door slid open with a soft buzz. He stepped into the heated air, and the first thing he saw was not the tree, not the smiles, not the polished surfaces. It was a young waitress in a red uniform, standing by the entrance with tears drying on her cheeks, bracing herself as if the next breath might be the one that finally breaks her. At that moment, Daniel understood that his little holiday experiment was about to show him far more than he had ever intended to see. The rush of Christmas Eve rolled in like a tide, and for a while the pace of the restaurant swallowed everything. Voices layered over music, trays weaving between chairs, the constant ding of the kitchen bell calling for hands that were already too full. Camilla moved through it on instinct, taking orders, refilling drinks, checking on kids who had dropped their crayons. The rhythm so familiar it almost numbed the rawness of what had happened earlier. At Daniel's corner table, her smile was careful but steady as she set down his plate and asked if he needed anything else, her voice polite, neutral, like a curtain drawn over a window. "I'm fine, thank you," he said, but his eyes followed her as she turned away, watching not just her, but the way the place moved around her. From this angle, he could see both the crowded dining room and the small island of the service station, where receipts, tip jars, and power quietly changed hands. It started with little things, the kind of details most customers never see, the kind Daniel had trained himself to notice during years in finance and years before that carrying trays himself. A table paid in cash near the window, the father patting his jacket pocket with satisfaction after leaving a folded bill on the check. Camilla thanked them warmly, cleared the plates, and slipped the money into the shared tip jar with a small, hopeful glance, a quick calculation already happening behind her eyes. Then, as she walked away to greet a new party, the manager drifted over, all smiles and holiday cheer, his hand landing on her shoulder in a gesture that could pass, from a distance, as friendly. When she moved on, he stayed, fingers reaching into the jar with the same easy familiarity he used to adjust the volume on the music, pulling out not just loose bills, but the thick, folded ones. Daniel watched him straighten up, hand closing around the cash before disappearing into his pocket with a casualness that made Daniel's stomach turn. At first, he wondered if there might be some system he didn't know about, some policy or end-of-night pooling method that justified the movement. But the way the manager glanced around, quick, sharp, making sure no one was looking too closely, told another story. A few minutes later, it happened again. Another table, another cash tip, another quiet swoop of the manager's hand as soon as Camilla's back was turned. The contrast between his booming laugh at the bar and the swift, practiced theft at the station sat like ice in Daniel's chest. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were hours of someone's life, folded into paper, being skimmed away before they ever reached the hands that had earned them. Eventually, Camilla noticed, not in a dramatic flash, but in the way someone who has been hungry for a long time notices a missing piece of bread. At a lull in the rush, she stepped back to the service station and frowned at the jar, tilting it gently as if a better angle might produce more money. Daniel could see her lips move as she counted quietly, eyes narrowing, then flicking toward the floor where the manager stood a few feet away, joking loudly with a server who laughed too quickly. She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron, the conflict playing out across her face. Say nothing and swallow the loss, or say something and risk the fragile scaffolding of hours and goodwill holding up her month. For a second, the star Sophia had taped to their apartment window seemed to hang behind her eyes, and then she drew in a breath that sounded from where Daniel sat, heavier than any tray. "Excuse me," she began, approaching the manager with her shoulders set just a little too straight, like someone walking under a load no one else could see. Her voice was soft but steady as she mentioned that the jar looked lighter than it should, that some tables had left good tips she wasn't seeing, carefully framing her concern as a question instead of an accusation. The manager's smile cooled without fully disappearing, his eyes narrowing with a kind of practiced annoyance as he reminded her that tips even out, and that she needed to trust the system if she wanted to keep fitting in. When she tried to answer, he cut across her with a low warning, reminding her again how many people would love to have your hours, and how much discretion he had over those hours. Camilla's jaw tightened, the protest dying quietly before reaching her lips, and she nodded, stepping back, the conversation ending not with an agreement, but with a small, invisible bruise. From his corner, Daniel felt something twist inside him, a mixture of anger and shame that didn't quite know where to land. He had read the bonuses this manager had earned, had seen the words "excellent control of labor and costs" typed neatly beside his name, had signed off on them without a second thought. Now, watching the man walk away from the tip jar with cash in his pocket and a smirk on his face, he realized that those neat lines of praise had been built, in part, on 1,000 tiny thefts from people like Camilla. The tree in the corner shimmered with company-branded ornaments, little logos turned into snowflakes and stars meant to suggest generosity and holiday spirit. Under that glow, a young mother's hope for a slightly better paycheck had just been picked apart, bill by the very person entrusted to lead her. And for the first time that night, Daniel's discomfort stopped being vague and distant. It settled sharp and clear into a single, unmistakable thought. This is wrong, and it has my name on it. The next wave of customers arrived in a burst of cold air and chatter, and for a while the restaurant slipped back into its mechanical rhythm. Orders taken, plates delivered, credit cards signed with distracted flourishes. On the surface, nothing about Camilla had changed. She still moved quickly, still remembered extra napkins for families with kids, still noticed when someone's drink was almost empty. But somewhere under the apron and the polite phrases, something in her had hardened, the way glass hardens after it has already cracked. Every time she passed the tip jar, her eyes flicked toward it and then away. A small, involuntary movement that betrayed more than she ever said out loud. From his corner table, Daniel noticed the way her jaw set when the manager walked too close, and how she forced herself to relax her shoulders a moment later, as if she could will her body not to show she was afraid. The confrontation came like bad weather that everyone could feel before the first drops fell. A ticket got lost, or an order got mixed, no one was quite sure which, and suddenly the manager's voice sliced through the murmur of the room, calling Camilla back to the service station with a sharpness that made even the dishwasher flinch. She arrived with her notepad still in hand, cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen, and before she could speak, he was already gesturing at the screen, at the table, at the clock, at anything that might look like evidence if someone glanced over. His words weren't just about the mistake, they were about attitude, about causing problems, about bringing personal drama to work, each phrase landing like a stone being added to a pile on her back. The dining room music kept playing something soft and nostalgic, but around the service station there was a different kind of silence, the silence of people pretending they didn't hear. Camilla tried to answer carefully, picking each word as if it might explode in her hands. She mentioned the long week, the extra tables, the confusion at the POS, keeping her tone low and respectful, adding "sir" where she never had the energy to add it before. She didn't mention the missing tips or the way her hours had suddenly started shrinking on the schedule. Those topics now felt like live wires she couldn't afford to touch. The manager stepped closer, his voice dropping into that dangerous calm that always came before a threat, and reminded her that he decided who got what shifts, who closed, who opened, who ended up begging for extra hours, and who didn't. "If you're unhappy," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "there are plenty of people out there who would be grateful for what you have." The word grateful twisted inside her like a knife because she was grateful, grateful enough to stay quiet even when every part of her wanted to scream. In the narrow hallway behind the kitchen, where the smell of grease clung to the walls and the floor tiles were chipped from years of hurried footsteps, co-workers whispered when they thought no one was listening. One busboy muttered about unpaid overtime, about the time clock accidentally rounding their hours down instead of up. A line cook swore his schedule was always cut the week after he complained about safety in the back. Camilla heard pieces of these stories between orders, little fragments traded like contraband, and recognized her own fears in each one. She wasn't the only one watching the posted schedule every week like it was a verdict. She wasn't the only one whose benefits always seemed to be just out of reach on some technicality. Yet when the manager walked by, the whispers folded themselves back into smiles, into "yes, chef," into "right away," the survival instincts of people who had learned that pride could be dangerous if it ever showed above the surface. From his table, Daniel saw more than he had ever wanted to see. He saw the way conversations died, the moment the manager entered a room, the way backs straightened and eyes dropped with the automatic obedience of people who needed their next paycheck more than they needed dignity. He saw Camilla return to the dining room after that latest lecture, her face smoothed over, her smile restored, but her movements just a shade more mechanical, as if she had tucked herself away somewhere deep where no one could reach her. The company's holiday slogan smiled at him from the menu again, treated like family, and suddenly the phrase felt heavy in his hands, almost obscene. As he watched her pour water for a table that would never know her name, he felt the weight of his own pride, the pride that had once celebrated lean labor models and strong management, settle over him like a stone cloak. Somewhere beneath the music and the laughter and the clinking glasses, one quiet truth pressed against his ribs. The fear in this room wasn't an accident, and if he turned away now, it would belong to him as surely as his name on the door. By the time the dinner rush reached its peak, the restaurant felt like a machine running too hot. Every table occupied, every chair pulled close, every voice raised a little just to be heard over the noise. Camilla moved through the chaos in a kind of focused trance, balancing plates and drink orders, remembering who wanted extra lemon and which child was allergic to nuts, holding the whole map of the dining room in her head. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck, dampening the collar of her red shirt, but she didn't slow down. Non posso perdere essa noite, she kept repeating to herself, as if the words alone could protect her hours. From his corner, Daniel watched the way she pushed through exhaustion, seeing not just a server doing her job, but a woman trying to outrun something that kept gaining on her. The tree sparkled near the bar, reflecting on polished glasses, and if you didn't look too closely, everything looked like success. The call came at the worst possible moment, not shouted this time, but delivered in a deceptively calm tone that made Camilla's skin prickle. "When you're done with that table, I need you in the office," the manager said as he passed, his voice low, his smile fixed for the customers watching, his eyes promising anything but kindness. She finished dropping off dessert plates with a practiced laugh she didn't feel, then handed her tray to a co-worker with a quick apology before slipping toward the back. The hallway to the office always felt narrow, but tonight it felt like a tunnel, the noise of the dining room fading behind her as the air cooled and the smell of bleach and old paperwork replaced the scent of food. Inside the small office, crowded with filing cabinets and a computer that hummed too loudly, the door clicked shut with a finality that made her heart skip. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, waiting, like a student called in to hear bad news she already suspected. The manager didn't waste time. He spun his chair toward the desk, pulled a stack of printed schedules from a folder, and laid them out like cards in a losing game. His tone was almost sympathetic as he talked about budget constraints, about corporate targets, about how everyone has to make sacrifices. But the numbers on the page told another story. Her name, circled in red ink, trailed off the end of the schedule with fewer and fewer hours, entire days disappearing as if someone had erased them with a careless hand. Camilla felt the blood drain from her face as she traced the lines with her eyes, counting silently, doing the math that now lived in her bones: rent, electricity, food, bus fare, hospital bills. "This isn't personal," he said, spreading his hands as if to show they were empty, though she knew very well how quickly they filled when the tip jar was left alone. "If it doesn't work for you, of course, you're free to look for something else." She tried to explain, not with anger at first, but with desperation so raw it almost softened her voice instead of sharpening it. She talked about Sophia's surgery, about the letter from the hospital, about the nights she had stayed past closing without complaining, hoping that loyalty would count for something when she needed it most. For a moment, something flickered across the manager's face, a hint of discomfort, or maybe just annoyance at having to listen. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the same cool smile he wore when charming difficult customers. Then came the part that felt less like a conversation and more like a confession he was proud of. He mentioned, almost casually, that keeping her just under the threshold for full-time status had been the smart play, that it kept costs down and made the numbers look good for corporate. The words washed over her like cold water, and she realized this wasn't a sudden cut. It had been a controlled starve, measured and deliberate, dressed up as policy. Just outside the half-closed door, in the shadow of the hallway where an old exit sign buzzed faintly, Daniel stood very still, listening to every word as if the walls had turned transparent. The phrases were horribly familiar. Labor optimization, benefit thresholds, controlling overhead, lines he had heard in boardrooms, nodded along to, even praised in year-end reviews. Hearing them now, spoken not as strategy but as justification for crushing a single mother's life, made his stomach clench. The bonus reports he had approved flashed through his mind, the neat summaries praising this very manager for exceptional cost control, and each one felt now like a signed permission slip for cruelty. Inside the office, Camilla's voice cracked as she thanked the manager for letting her know, because pride would not allow her to beg, not even with her world collapsing around her. When she finally stepped back into the hallway, schedule copy clutched in her hand, she looked for a second like someone who had just been told a sentence rather than a decision. Daniel watched her walk toward the staff bathroom, shoulders shaking just once before she vanished behind the door, and understood with painful clarity that the system breaking her was not an accident at the edge of his empire. It was his system, humming exactly as it had been built. In the staff bathroom, with its humming fluorescent light and tired mirror, Camilla locked the door and finally let her body sag against the sink. The schedule copy crinkled in her hand, the red circles bleeding faintly where her sweaty fingers pressed too hard, as if even the ink understood what had just been taken from her. She stared at her reflection, the red uniform, the dark smudges under her eyes, the strands of hair escaping her ponytail, and for a moment she didn't see a waitress at all. She saw a mother standing on the edge of a cliff with nothing but air beneath her feet. The noise of the restaurant seeped in through the thin door, laughter, cutlery, the steady thump of music, mockingly unchanged by the quiet disaster unfolding inside this small, tiled room. She turned on the tap and splashed cold water on her face, not to wake up, but to wash away the proof that she had almost cried where someone might see. She gripped the edge of the sink and closed her eyes, letting the roaring in her ears settle into something that sounded like breathing. In the darkness behind her lids, images lined up one after the outro. Sophia's thin wrist with the hospital bracelet, the letter folded in her bag, the cheap little tree at home under the window filled with paper stars. Deus, eu não sei mais o que fazer, she whispered, the words shaky and unsure, because she wasn't even certain who she was talking to anymore. Prayer had once come easily, a habit formed in childhood, but lately it felt like leaving voicemail on a number that never called back. Still, there was no one else to hear her in that moment, so she sent the words into the silence anyway, hoping they might land somewhere other than the hollow space inside her chest. When she unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway, she did what working people have always done when the world refuses to pause for their grief. She put herself away. One breath to straighten her spine, one to smooth her apron, one to paste a neutral expression back onto her face. By the time she pushed through the swinging door into the roar of the dining room, the customers at table 12 were waving for refills, and a child at table 7 had dropped a fork, and life demanded her hands before her heart had any chance to protest. She moved from table to table like someone walking underwater, everything a little slower, a little distant. Yet she still remembered who wanted more ice, who had asked for no onions, who needed their check as soon as possible, sweetie. With every "of course" and "my pleasure," she felt a tiny piece of herself go quiet, as if she were gently turning off lights in rooms no one visited anymore. Out by the entrance, Daniel stepped outside under the pretense of taking a call, though his phone stayed in his pocket for a long minute while he just stood there in the cold. The night air hit his face like a slap, sharp and clean after the thick warmth of the restaurant, and he drew in a breath so deep it almost hurt. From the sidewalk, the place looked perfect again, golden light, silhouettes moving smoothly, a Christmas tree glowing like a promise in the window. Someone passing by might have thought, what a lucky group, working for a company that treats them like family, and up until tonight, Daniel himself might have nodded along with that illusion. Now, with the words from the office still echoing in his head, the sign above the door bearing his logo seemed to flicker, the way an old neon light flickers when the wiring underneath starts to fail. He finally pulled out his phone and stared at the dark screen, his reflection faintly visible over the wallpaper image of a younger version of himself, apron-stained, face flushed from kitchen heat, smiling proudly at the first restaurant he had ever managed. Back then, every extra dollar of profit had felt like proof that he was climbing out of the life he'd known, that he was building something that mattered. Somewhere along the way, the numbers had gotten bigger, the offices higher, the parties fancier, and the people at the bottom of the reports had turned into lines on a spreadsheet instead of lives like his own. He thought of Camilla standing at the door with tears on her cheeks, of the schedule with her hours slashed, of the casual cruelty with which the manager had spoken of keeping her under the threshold. In the quiet space between one breath and the next, a question rose that he couldn't push down this time. If this is what my success costs, what exactly have I been so proud of? When Daniel finally went back inside, the heat hit him again, fogging his glasses for a second and blurring the whole room into soft shapes of red and gold. He wiped the lenses with the edge of his sweater, and when his vision cleared, the restaurant snapped back into focus, like a picture he could no longer pretend was pretty from every angle. Camilla was at a table near the tree, bending slightly to listen to an older woman who seemed to be complaining about something trivial. Even from across the room, he could see the way Camilla nodded, apologized, smoothed over the moment with a patience she no longer had to give. A busboy hurried past him toward the kitchen, carrying a tub of dirty dishes stacked too high, his thin arms straining just enough that the plates rattled like nervous teeth. Daniel sat down again, this time not as a man grabbing dinner, but as someone who had decided quietly that he was done only watching. He didn't have to go looking for the first crack in the wall of silence. It stumbled right up to him, wide-eyed and flustered, in the form of that same busboy a few minutes later. A glass slipped from the pile as the young man passed Daniel's table, shattering on the floor in a spray of light and sound that made several nearby diners jump. Instantly, the kid began to apologize, bending down, hands shaking as he tried to gather shards with a flimsy bar towel, his voice tripping over "sorry" so many times it stopped sounding like a word. Daniel raised a hand, told him gently to be careful, that it was just a glass, and for a second their eyes met. One pair calm, the other full of the kind of panic that has nothing to do with broken dishes. "If he sees this, I'm dead," the boy muttered without thinking, glancing toward the bar where the manager was busy entertaining a table of big tippers. The fear in his voice didn't match the size of the mistake. It matched the history behind it. Daniel knelt to help, ignoring the confused looks from nearby guests, and together they nudged the glass into a safer pile until a broom appeared. "Busy night," Daniel said quietly, keeping his tone light, as if this were idle conversation. The busboy huffed a short, humorless laugh and nodded. Then, perhaps because someone had been kind when he expected anger, he let a piece of truth slip. "Busy is good, they say, unless you make one wrong move," he murmured, glancing again at the bar. "You work a double, they forget to clock you in right. You ask about it, then boom, no closing shifts next week." His words came out in a rush, like water squeezing through a narrow crack, and once they were free, he seemed startled by his own honesty. He straightened quickly, mumbling that he should get back to work, but the sentence he had dropped between them remained, heavy and glowing, like a coal on the table. Later, an older cook brought Daniel a plate that he hadn't ordered, an extra side dish, something simple but clearly made with care, and set it down with an awkward half-smile. His apron was stained, his hairline damp with sweat, and his eyes carried the tiredness of a man who had seen too many Christmas Eves from the wrong side of a kitchen door. "On the house," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder as if the walls themselves might be listening. When Daniel started to protest, the man shook his head. Saw how you talked to the kid and to her," he added, nodding almost imperceptibly in a direção de Camila. "She's had a rough time. A good word, a gentle customer. That stuff matters more than you think." There was a pause, and then, as if the dam inside him had been waiting for years for just one safe ear, he spoke a little more. About shifts cut after complaints, about people disappearing from the schedule when they pushed back, about tips that were never quite what the night should have brought. He didn't name the manager directly. He didn't have to. The shape of the story was already clear. As the evening crept toward closing time, Daniel sat with his half-eaten meal and his untouched drink, phone face down on the table, mind racing faster than the orders had at the peak of the rush. The stories he'd heard were small in the telling. A missing hour here, a vanished tip there, a threat tucked inside a smile. But together they formed a pattern as sharp and undeniable as broken glass. This wasn't one bad night or one unlucky employee. It was a network of quiet harm, woven into the daily routine of a place that dared to call itself family. Across the room, Camilla paused for a second near the service station to check her phone. Even from where he sat, Daniel could see the faint glow of a childish drawing on the screen. 2 figures under a crooked Christmas tree, hands joined. She smiled at it just barely, before slipping the device back into her pocket and reaching for her tray again. Watching her, Daniel understood that the spark he'd been hoping to feel tonight, the comforting confirmation that everything under his logo was as warm and honest as the ads, had come in a very different form. It wasn't reassurance. It was a small, stubborn flame of anger and responsibility, lighting up a single, undeniable fact. Now that he knew the truth, pretending ignorance was no longer an option. The decision to stop being just another customer happened so quietly that Daniel almost didn't notice it inside his own mind. One moment he was watching, the next he was reaching for his phone with a purpose that felt heavier than habit. He stepped out toward the small vestibule near the restrooms, where the music dulled and the light took on a tired yellow tone, and finally dialed the number of his most trusted assistant. She answered on the second ring, expecting a simple holiday check-in or a question about the next day's meetings, but what came out of Daniel's mouth was something else entirely. The address of the restaurant, the name of the manager, a request for every HR file, complaint log, and performance review attached to this place. His voice was low but steady as he asked her to flag anything related to overtime disputes, benefits thresholds, or staff concerns about hostile management. Phrases that sounded clinical on paper but, tonight, were the translation of the pain he had seen in tired eyes and shaking hands. On the other end, there was a brief, stunned silence, as if she were realizing along with him that this was not a casual curiosity. It was an investigation. While he waited for the first documents to load, Daniel stood with his back to the wall and listened to the muffled sounds of the restaurant through the door. A burst of laughter, the scrape of a chair, the clink of someone's celebratory toast. It was strange, hearing the life of the place continue while his own perception of it shifted inch by inch, like someone adjusting the focus on a camera and finally seeing what had always been there. His phone buzzed softly as files began to arrive, PDFs, spreadsheets, scanned forms, and with each tap, another layer of the carefully polished picture he'd been sold began to peel away. There were complaints about missing hours, written in polite but anxious language, notes about clarified policy and employee counseled, stamped with closure dates that came too quickly and neatly to be real. A pattern emerged in the way issues were described and dismissed. Like a script, the manager and someone in HR had rehearsed together until it became muscle memory. The numbers he had once praised, high sales, low labor, minimal benefits payout, suddenly looked less like proof of brilliance and more like smoke rising from a house on fire. He slipped back into the dining room, with his phone dimmed in his hand, taking his seat again in the corner, as if he were just returning from the restroom, no different from any other guest. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer simply Daniel the customer, or even Daniel the owner. He was Daniel the witness, carrying the weight of what he now knew. From this vantage point, he could see the manager at the bar, charm turned up to full brightness as he joked with a group of well-dressed men, refilling their drinks personally, laughing too loudly at their stories. The same man whose name showed up in the files as the subject of concerns and reports stood there basking in the glow of his own performance, celebrated by corporate for numbers that, Daniel now realized, had been carved out of people's lives. Camilla passed behind him with a tray full of empty dessert plates, and the manager barely glanced at her, except to gesture toward another table with the lazy flick of someone directing traffic, not human beings. To everyone else, it looked like a well-run shift. To Daniel, it looked like a crime scene where the blood had been replaced with exhaustion and silence. The longer he watched, the more the small details sharpened. The way Camilla automatically stepped aside to give the manager a wide berth. The way the busboy flinched when a glass clinked too hard. The way the hostess's smile faltered for half a second whenever she checked the time, as if counting down to the end of a sentence. Between checking one document and the next, Daniel began to jot notes on his phone, not just figures and dates, but impressions, phrases, specific incidents he had seen with his own eyes. It felt almost like going back in time to his first years in hospitality, when he had wanted to change things, to be the kind of boss who remembered birthdays and stepped in when customers crossed the line. Somewhere along the way, that man had been buried under quarterly reports and investor calls, under the pressure to always push the graphs higher. Now, watching Camilla refill water at a table where no one bothered to look at her, he felt that younger version of himself stirring, not as nostalgia but as a kind of accusation. You knew what this felt like once. How did you let yourself forget? Out near the entrance, a family gathered their coats, children sleepy and sticky with dessert, parents fumbling for keys and leftovers, thanking Camilla for the wonderful service as they went. She smiled and wished them a Merry Christmas, and when the door swung shut behind them, she allowed her shoulders to sink for just half a second before straightening again and reaching for the next table's check. Daniel watched her, the report still open on his screen, and understood that he had crossed an invisible line tonight. He could not unhear the tremor in the busboy's voice, unsee the red circles on the schedule, unread the complaints marked resolved when nothing had been resolved at all. The room glittered with decorations and branded ornaments, every detail curated to say comfort and belonging. But beneath that surface, he now saw a truth that wouldn't stop pressing on his conscience. As long as he stayed silent, he was not just the owner of this place, he was the author of its harm. And somewhere between the clink of one last glass and the fading notes of another Christmas song, a decision began to form inside him, as steady and unavoidable as sunrise. This would not end as just one more sad night, he remembered. It would have consequences, starting with him. As the night thinned out and the tables slowly emptied, the restaurant took on that strange between-time feeling, no longer fully alive with guests, but not yet allowed to rest. Chairs scraped back, coats were pulled on, credit cards signed with sleepy impatience. Outside, the parking lot began to glitter with a thin dusting of frost. Camilla cleared one last table near the window, stacking plates with a care that had nothing to do with dishes and everything to do with staying busy enough not to think. Her legs trembled with a mixture of exhaustion and something heavier she refused to name. The schedule copy folded so tightly in her apron pocket it felt like a shard of glass against her hip. "Almost there," one of the other servers murmured in passing, but for Camilla, the end of the shift no longer meant rest. It meant going home and opening a calculator on her phone to confirm, in cold numbers, that the math of her life had finally stopped working. In the corner, Daniel's table had become a small island in the dimming sea of the dining room, his half-eaten meal pushed aside, the candle on his table burning down to a tired puddle of wax. His phone glowed softly in his hand, screen filled with documents that had nothing to do with personal email or holiday greetings. He scrolled slowly, each new file another piece of a story he wished wasn't true. Internal memos praising tight labor management, notes about resolving complaints by re-educating staff on policy, performance reviews that celebrated this manager's uncanny ability to keep benefits payouts well below projected thresholds. The language was smooth, professional, almost soothing if you didn't know what it meant in real life. But tonight, every euphemism translated itself in his mind. Fewer hours here, a denied doctor's visit there, rent paid late again, a child's medication postponed another week. The big-picture success he had been so proud of now looked in miniature, like a row of small, merciless cuts. Then he opened a file that made his hand still on the screen. It was one more complaint form, time-stamped months earlier, the text polite and careful, as if the person writing it were afraid of taking up too much space even on a digital page. She described discrepancies in her hours, tips that didn't match what customers had told her they left, confusion about why her status never seemed to cross the line into full-time despite the number of shifts she'd worked. She wrote about needing stability for her child's medical care without saying too much, each sentence walking a delicate line between need and gratitude. At the bottom, the name sat in plain black letters, Camilla R. The resolution section below it was short and chillingly familiar. Issue addressed, employee counseled on understanding company policy. Stamped as resolved the very next day. No adjustments, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that her fears had been real. Daniel stared at the screen until the words blurred, the shame rising in him like heat because his signature had floated above this whole structure, giving it legitimacy. Somewhere in a file cabinet or a digital archive, this injustice had been neatly filed away as handled, and until tonight he had never known to ask what that meant. While he sat with that knowledge burning in his hands, Camilla stepped out the back door into the narrow strip of cold air behind the restaurant, the alley lined with dumpsters and old pallets, the smell of grease mixing with winter. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself and fished her phone out of her pocket with stiff fingers, staring at the cracked screen for a long moment before tapping on her mother's name. The call connected with a soft click, and the familiar voice on the other end greeted her with warmth that made her throat close instantly. For a few seconds, Camilla tried small talk. How was her mother feeling? Had she seen the neighbors' decorations? Did Sophia behave at home today? But the dam inside her had been compromised all evening, and now, out here in the dark, it finally gave way. In a rush of broken sentences, she confessed about the hours being cut, about the manager's threats, about the hospital letter that now seemed less like paper and more like a countdown. "You não sei como vou fazer, mãe," she whispered, turning her face away from the door as if the bricks might judge her. "I promised her. I promised Sophia this Christmas would be different, and I don't see how anymore." Through the thin back wall, where a hairline crack ran alongside the staff bulletin board, Daniel heard the muffled shape of that conversation, the low rhythm of Camilla's voice slipping into sobs, the occasional word rising clear enough to pierce the barrier. Cirurgia, horas cortadas, não dá mais. Não dá. He hadn't meant to linger here, but his feet had carried him toward the kitchen, toward the reality behind the dining room, and now he stood in the shadow of a freezer door, phone forgotten in his hand, listening to the sound of a promise collapsing. In his screen's reflection, he still saw the words "issue resolved" glowing faintly, prepared with her name, and something inside him finally snapped free of the careful restraints he'd kept on his conscience for years. The convenient stories he had told himself about not knowing, about trusting his team, about the cost of doing business, fell away like worn wallpaper, exposing raw, ugly wall beneath. As Camilla's voice cracked one more time on the other side of the wall, and her mother murmured something soft and helpless in reply, Daniel understood that he had reached a line that could not be uncrossed. Whatever happened next would change more than one schedule, more than one restaurant. It would change the way he lived with his own reflection. And for the first time that night, the question raging in him was no longer, should I intervene? It was how, and how far, he was willing to go. By the time the last wave of customers settled in with their desserts and coffee refills, the restaurant had entered that strange, glittering pause before closing, when everyone pretends the night can stretch on forever. The Christmas tree near the center of the dining room glowed brighter than ever, its lights reflected in wine glasses and silverware, ornaments carrying the company logo turning slowly with the air from the vents. The manager, flushed with the satisfaction of a profitable night, clapped his hands once and called the staff over, announcing some special words to celebrate their hard work. Servers traded quick glances, the kind that said we still have tables, but one by one they drifted toward the tree anyway, pulled by habit and hierarchy. Camilla wiped her hands on her apron and joined the small semicircle, her body present, her mind already drifting toward bus schedules and overdue bills, the folded schedule still a hard edge against her hip. Daniel watched the gathering from his corner table, feeling his pulse in his throat as the moment he had been circling all night finally took shape. He could have left, he knew. That would have been the easier story, the one where the billionaire saw something unpleasant and convinced himself he had followed up later in meetings and memos. But the sound of Camilla's sobs behind the wall, the words "issue resolved" next to her name, the sight of the stolen tips sliding into the manager's pocket, none of it would let him move. He stood up slowly, leaving his jacket on the chair, but taking his phone with him, the screen still open on a file that had become, in his mind, Exhibit A. From where he stood now, he could see everyone at once. The tired busboy hovering at the edge of the group, the cook peering out from the kitchen door, the hostess trying to smooth her hair and stand taller, Camilla, with her head slightly bowed, as if bracing for another speech that would thank them without ever really seeing them. The manager began to talk, his voice full and warm, carefully modulated for the room, the way someone might pitch a commercial. He thanked the team for their dedication, for sticking it out through a tough year, for trusting his leadership, each phrase polished by repetition. He joked about how he had to be tough sometimes to keep things running smoothly, earning a few forced laughs from people who had heard the sharp edges of that toughness firsthand. He gestured grandly at the dining room, at the satisfied guests, at the full reservation book on the host stand, calling it proof that they were doing things right. And corporate noticed, he added with a proud little smile, tapping his chest. We got one of the best performance reviews in the region, labor costs under control, benefits in check, productivity through the roof. They're calling this store a model. Behind his words, Daniel could practically hear the exact sentences he had once used to praise him. Before the applause could start, Daniel stepped forward, the sound of his shoes on the floor cutting through the last note of a Christmas song playing over the speakers. Interesting, he said, his voice calm but carrying, not loud, yet somehow louder than the music itself. A few heads turned. The manager's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he turned, already ready to charm yet another customer. Sir, if you'll give us just a moment, he began smoothly. We're just wrapping up. Daniel didn't move. He stood a few paces away from the group, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone loosely at his side. his gaze locked on the man he'd read about for years, but only truly seen tonight. "I'm curious," Daniel went on, tilting his head slightly. "When you say labor costs under control and benefits in check, do you usually explain to your staff exactly what that looks like for them?" The question landed like a glass dropped in the middle of the room. Every sound seemed to pause, even the hum of the refrigeration units in the back. The manager's eyes narrowed just a touch, his smile tightening. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir," he replied, still in that polite public tone, but with an undercurrent that told the staff he was irritated. "I'm just doing my job, same as everyone else. We follow policy here." Daniel's gaze flicked briefly to Camilla, then back. "Policy," he repeated, letting the words sit between them. "Is it policy to take cash from the tip jar when your servers' backs are turned? To adjust time cards so overtime disappears? To keep schedules just under the benefits threshold while telling people they should be grateful?" A ripple went through the small crowd. The busboy's eyes widened, the hostess's hand flew to her mouth, and Camilla's fingers curled into her apron, knuckles whitening. The manager laughed, a brittle, incredulous sound. "Sir, with all respect, you've clearly misunderstood what you've seen. You're a guest. You don't know how restaurants work. We're just trying to stay afloat in a tough business." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He simply looked at the man, the way one might look at a mirror they've avoided for too long, and then he reached into his pocket, not for his wallet, but for the thin official card he had slipped there out of habit earlier in the evening. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I'm a guest here tonight, but I also happen to know exactly how this restaurant works." He stepped closer into the full glow of the Christmas tree and held up the card between two fingers, angled so the staff could see before the manager did. The logo at the top matched the one on their uniforms. Below it, in clear, sharp letters, was his name and title, the title that had once felt like a trophy and now felt like a verdict. Recognition moved through the staff like a wave, shock and confusion colliding, a soft gasp from the hostess, a whispered, "No pot sir," from somewhere near the kitchen door. The manager's face drained of color as his eyes flicked from the card to Daniel's face and back again, the well-practiced smile finally cracking. In that suspended moment, with the tree shining brilliantly behind them and the half-empty restaurant holding its breath, Daniel let the silence speak first. The man who had slipped into the building hoping to feel the warmth of his own myth now stood revealed in the center of it, under the same lights that had watched every stolen tip, every cut hour, every swallowed protest. Camilla's gaze lifted slowly to his, something like disbelief and fragile hope warring in her eyes, as if she couldn't yet decide whether this new twist in her night was another cruel joke or the first sign that the story might change. Around them, the decorations continued to twinkle, the branded ornaments spinning gently, but the mood had shifted entirely. It was no longer a commercial, it was a reckoning. And as Daniel drew breath to speak again, with every eye upon him, one question hung raw and electric in the air. Now that everyone knew exactly who he was, would he choose to defend the system that bore his name, or finally tear it down in front of the people it had been breaking all along? For a long, suspended heartbeat, no one moved. The only sound in the room was the soft buzz of the lights wrapped around the tree and the faint clink of a spoon settling in an abandoned coffee cup. Daniel let the recognition settle into their faces, the busboy's mouth slightly open, the hostess's eyes wide, the cook half out of the kitchen doorway, Camilla staring as if she'd stumbled into someone else's dream. The manager was the first to recover, forcing a shaky laugh, reaching instinctively for charm, like a man grabbing a lifebuoy. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, voice a touch too high. "Mr. Daniel, sir, if we'd known you were coming, we'd have rolled out the red carpet." He took a step forward, as if to clap him on the shoulder, to fold him into the performance, into the careful story he'd been telling corporate for years. Daniel didn't move. He just slipped the ID card back into his pocket and met the man's eyes with a calm that made the room feel colder than the winter air outside. "I prefer it this way," Daniel replied, his tone low but carrying the voice of someone used to speaking in boardrooms but choosing different words tonight. Unannounced. Less edited. He turned slightly, looking not just at the manager but at the staff gathered in that sad little semicircle by the tree, each of them holding invisible weights over invisible cliffs. "I've spent the evening listening," he went on, "watching, reading my own company's files in the corner while you worked." He lifted his phone a little, the glow catching the edge of his face. "I've read complaints that were closed without action. I've seen tips disappear from jars. I've heard overtime stories that don't match the time cards, and I've heard more than once that people would kill for this job, as if fear were a company value." A murmur ran through the group, soft but undeniable, the sound of people realizing that what they had whispered in back hallways had somehow reached the very top of the building whose logo sat on their chests. The manager tried to regain his footing, switching tactics with the speed of someone who had long survived by improvising. "Sir, you're only hearing one side," he protested, spreading his hands. "These kids exaggerate. They don't understand how tight margins are. We've kept this store profitable. We've hit every target you set. Sometimes you have to be tough to protect the bottom line. If we start handing out hours like candy, if we start paying every overtime just because someone claims it, this place doesn't run. I did what I had to do to deliver what corporate asked for." His gaze darted to the staff, silently urging them to back him up, to nod, to say, "It's fine, we're fine." No one spoke. Even the Christmas music felt wrong now, the cheery melody drifting through a room that suddenly tasted of iron and old dust. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that felt like it came from years back instead of just hours. "I did set targets," he admitted, and the confession itself seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. "I did approve bonuses based on numbers that looked very impressive on paper. I allowed a system where cost control became more important than the people doing the work." He paused, the admission hanging heavy. Then his voice sharpened. "But I did not tell you to steal from your staff. I did not tell you to manipulate schedules to keep a sick child from health coverage. I did not tell you to use fear as a management strategy and then call it family." "That part?" He shook his head once, very slightly. "That's on you." The manager opened his mouth, but no words came. The staff's attention had shifted. Their eyes were no longer on the man who controlled their hours. They were on the man who controlled him. He turned fully toward the workers now, the tired circle of faces who had carried his logo through every rush and slow night. "Camila," he said gently, and her name in his mouth sounded different from when customers used it just to get their refills faster. She blinked, as if pulled from far away. "I read the complaint you filed months ago," he continued, his voice softening. "The one about your missing hours, your tips. I saw how it was closed, marked as resolved, with a note that you had been counseled." Her lips parted in a small, disbelieving breath. No one had ever told her what had happened to that message once she hit send. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and the words were strangely heavy coming from someone like him, who was used to apologies crafted by lawyers and PR teams. "I'm sorry that under my name, under my policies, you were made to feel small, disposable, punished for asking for what you had already earned. I'm sorry that tonight, instead of thinking about your daughter's Christmas, you've been wondering how to survive January." A shimmer of tears filled her eyes, but they didn't fall. She was too used to holding them in. Still, her chin trembled in a way that told everyone in the room this apology had landed somewhere deep. Then, in a voice that belonged neither to the boardroom nor to the marketing campaigns, Daniel spoke the words that would redraw the lines of the night. "Effective immediately," he said, turning back to the manager. "You are suspended from duty at this location. You will not handle schedules, time cards, or tips while a full investigation is conducted." The manager's face went from pale to red in a heartbeat, sputtering about overreactions and one-sided stories, but Daniel held up a hand, silencing him with a simple, practiced gesture. "There will be an independent review," he continued, addressing the staff again. "Not run by your manager. Not buried in email threads. You will each have a chance to speak confidentially, directly to people I trust, to tell them how things have been run here, and anything that was taken from you, hours, pay, opportunities for benefits, we will make it right." The word "right" hung in the air like a bell, and for the first time that evening some of the workers looked at one another, not just in fear, but in something fragile and unfamiliar: cautious belief. The charity donation box sat by the register, wrapped in festive paper, claiming to raise money for families in need, with the company logo stamped proudly on the side. Daniel's gaze fell on it as the manager stood stiff and furious by the tree, and the irony twisted like a knife in his chest. "We've been very proud of our donations," he said quietly, moving toward the box. "Our campaigns, our commercials about kindness." He rested his hand on the lid. "But charity that starts out here and never reaches in here," he gestured to the staff, to the kitchen, to Camilla's tired face, "isn't really kindness. It's a costume." He looked around once more, taking in the decorations, the glitter, the company-branded ornaments. "Tonight, I'm not interested in costumes." For a moment, nobody breathed. Even the tree seemed to stand straighter. And in that heavy pause, as the suspended manager swallowed his outrage and the staff tried to understand what this night had just become, the story they were all trapped in began, quietly but unmistakably, to turn. The next days moved in a blur that felt almost unreal to Camilla, like one of those Christmas movies Sophia loved, where everything goes wrong before it somehow, impossibly goes right. The morning after that long, shattered shift, she woke up with swollen eyes and a headache, convinced for a moment that she had dreamed the whole scene under the tree. The card, the suspension, the word "sorry," spoken by a man whose name she'd only ever seen on pay stubs and posters. But then her phone buzzed with a message from a co-worker, a screenshot of a company-wide email announcing a temporary leadership change at their location and an independent review being launched immediately. Underneath, her friend had typed only 3 words: "Elle no mentiu." He didn't lie. Camilla sat on the edge of her bed, letter from the hospital still folded on the nightstand, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted in her favor. At the restaurant, the atmosphere changed almost overnight, not like a miracle, but like a room where someone had finally opened a window. A corporate team arrived, people in simple clothes, clipboards in hand, faces serious but not cold, asking to speak to each staff member one by one, behind a closed door where the manager no longer sat like a gatekeeper. Camilla's voice shook during her interview, but the woman across from her didn't rush her, didn't flinch when she described stolen tips, cut hours, threats delivered with a smile. She just took notes and said, "Thank you, this shouldn't have happened." Word spread quickly that others had told similar stories, that the pattern Daniel had seen was now being drawn clearly in ink, line after line, so it could no longer be ignored. Pay adjustments began to appear in their accounts, small at first, then larger, a missing hour here, a corrected tip there, until one afternoon Camilla opened her banking app and stared, stunned, at a deposit labeled back pay. It wasn't everything life owed her, but it was enough that the numbers in her head finally stopped marching toward a cliff. Then the call came from a number she didn't recognize, with a calm voice on the other end that introduced herself as a medical liaison working on behalf of the company. Camilla almost hung up thinking it was a scam, until the woman mentioned Sophia by name and the hospital that had sent the impossible letter. Gently, matter-of-factly, she explained that the company had activated a special fund to cover the surgery and related expenses, that the hospital had already been contacted, that they were expediting Sophia's case because this delay should never have been about money. Camilla sank into a chair, one hand pressed to her forehead, the other gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles hurt. Questions tumbled out. "Are you sure? Is there a catch? What about the plan I don't have?" But the answers to her disbelief stayed the same. "We're taking care of it. Focus on your daughter." When she finally hung up, Sophia was at the table cutting out more paper stars, and for a moment Camilla just watched her, tears sliding down silently, before crossing the room to pull her into an embrace that startled a laugh out of the little girl. On the day of the surgery, the hospital felt both too big and too small, a maze of white halls and soft beeping where time seemed to stretch and fold in strange ways. Camilla sat in the waiting area outside the operating room, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers went numb, the hospital bracelet around Sophia's wrist still imprinted in her mind. Papers had been signed, costs had been handled. That was the word they used, as if money was something you could simply move out of the way with a firm hand. But the fear remained, stubborn and sharp. She was so deep in the fog of worry that she didn't hear the footsteps at first, only looked up when a shadow settled into the seat beside her. Daniel was dressed simply again, no suit, no entourage, just that same grey sweater and a paper visitor's badge clipped to his chest, their logo printed in small letters over a larger, more anonymous word, "Guest." For a second she thought she was hallucinating from stress. He gave her a small, uncertain smile, as if he were the one intruding. "I heard she was going in today," he said quietly. "I wanted to be here, if that's okay." Camilla stared at him, caught between gratitude and a deep, bone-level anger that didn't quite know where to land. Part of her wanted to ask where he had been all those months she'd sat in this same building counting crumpled bills. Another part knew that without what he'd done these last few days, she might not be sitting here at all. In the end, she just nodded, her voice not quite ready to trust itself. They sat in silence for a while, watching nurses move back and forth, listening to the distant hum of machines. Eventually, Daniel spoke again, words slow and careful, like someone walking on unfamiliar ground. He told her about his first job in a place not so different from hers, about the promises he had made to himself back then, about the ways those promises had gotten lost under layers of success, until a Christmas Eve forced him to see the human cost of his comfort. "I can't give you back the nights you spent scared," he said, eyes fixed on some point ahead only he could see. "But I can make sure my company never does this to anyone again. And I can try, from here on out, to earn the right to say we're a family, not just print it on menus." The words didn't fix everything, but they settled into the room with a weight that felt, for the first time, like responsibility instead of performance. When the doctor finally emerged with tired eyes and a small, relieved smile, the world seemed to contract to the sound of her voice. The surgery had gone well. Sophia was stable. They could see her soon. Camilla sagged forward, hands covering her face, a sob tearing free, not of despair this time, but of something messier and stranger, relief, disbelief, a grief for all the fear she had carried alone for so long. She felt a hand hover near her shoulder, then rest there lightly. Daniel's touch was hesitant, respectful, as if he understood that this moment belonged first to her, not to any grand gesture he might make. Later, in the dim light of the recovery room, Christmas decorations taped to the walls in uneven clusters. Camilla sat by Sophia's bed, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. On the window, someone had stuck a few cheap paper stars, the hospital's attempt at holiday cheer, and they glowed faintly against the night. As Camilla reached out to trace one with her fingertip, she realized that, for the first time in a long time, the hope inside her didn't feel like a fragile thing balanced on a tray. It felt like something rooted, something that might stay. And just beyond that fragile piece, waiting like the first light before dawn, was the larger question this night had opened for both of them. Now that justice had begun here, in this small room with a sleeping child, what kind of future would they choose to build from it? For the company, for the people under its sign, and for the man who finally decided to see. By the time the next Christmas season came around, the restaurant didn't look all that different to a stranger's eye. The same red and gold ornaments, the same plastic holly along the walls, the same tree standing guard near the center of the dining room. The menus still carried the familiar slogan about treating everyone like family. The holiday playlist still looped through old songs that made people remember younger years. But for the people who tied the aprons and laced their shoes in the staff room, the air itself felt changed, lighter somehow, as if someone had finally opened a window that had been painted shut for years. Schedules were posted with hours that matched the conversations they'd had, not the threats they'd swallowed. Paychecks lined up with the nights they remembered working. The tip jar, watched now with casual trust instead of tight suspicion, belonged wholly to the hands that filled it. On the surface, business had gone on. Underneath, something like dignity had quietly taken root. Camilla still moved through the dining room with the same quick grace, balancing plates, remembering little details about regulars, but the way she carried herself was different now, as if she no longer had to make herself smaller to fit inside the job. Her shifts were steady, not doled out like favors, and for the first time she had a benefits card in her wallet with her own name on it, instead of a list of requirements she never managed to meet. At home, the thin plastic tree still stood under the same window, but the paper stars were joined now by a small, stuffed one that Sophia had insisted on hanging. A gift from a visitor who had stopped by the hospital with more humility than fanfare. Sophia ran through their small apartment with a strength that had once seemed like a risky dream, her scar healing, her laughter louder than the wheeze of the old radiator. When Camilla counted her money at the kitchen table these days, it was still tight, still a dance, but it no longer felt like trying to build a bridge with smoke. In his office, high above the city, Daniel kept fewer trophies on the walls than before, and more photographs on his desk. The reports still came, quarterly numbers, labor graphs, cost analyses, but they were no longer the only story he trusted. Beside his computer sat a framed picture of a little girl holding a paper star, grinning lopsidedly at the camera, her mother's arm wrapped around her like a promise kept. On mornings, when the weight of decisions pressed heavy on his shoulders, he would glance at that image and remember a different Christmas Eve, cheap fluorescent lights, a shaking voice on the other side of a wall, a manager bragging about controlling costs with methods that could never be justified by any chart. Policy documents had been rewritten since then, bonus structures reworked to reward fairness and safety rather than just savings. Anonymous reporting channels had been rebuilt from the ground up, this time with his personal oversight. It was slower work than writing a check or firing one man, but it felt for once like change that seeped into the foundation rather than just repainting the front door. Sometimes he still visited the restaurant where it had all begun, slipping in without announcement, not to catch anyone doing wrong, but to catch them doing right. He'd sit at a corner table with a simple meal and watch as a new manager, one chosen as much for empathy as for efficiency, helped run food when the line got long, thanked the dishwasher by name, asked the busboy about his classes. He'd see Camila laugh for real with a co-worker, watch the busboy move without flinching at every dropped glass, notice the hostess stretch her back and roll her shoulders without checking first to see if someone would call it bad attitude. Outside, customers still snapped photos by the tree, posted their blessed captions, clinked their glasses in the warm light. They would go home believing they'd visited a place that treated people like family, and for the first time, Daniel could listen to that story and know there was more truth than costume to it. Profit still mattered. Bills had to be paid, doors kept open, but it no longer sat alone at the top of the list. Beside it now were words he'd nearly lost along the way: decency, responsibility, heart. On Christmas Eve, as the restaurant's windows glowed against the cold, and Sophia pressed her face to the glass, laughing as she pointed out her mother inside, Daniel stood for a moment on the sidewalk and watched the reflection of his name above the door. It was the same logo as before, the same letters he'd once chased across every city he could reach, but the man looking up at it now was not the boy who had only wanted to win at any cost. He had seen what that cost could be: the tremor in a tired woman's hands, the rustle of a hospital letter, the sound of a promise breaking in the back alley of his own success, and he had chosen, finally, to pay a different price. Turning away from the glass, he let the door close behind him and stepped back into the ordinary night, pockets empty of disguises, heart a little heavier and somehow lighter at the same time. And if, somewhere out there, someone heard this story and felt something stir, a memory of a kindness given, a cruelty witnessed, a moment when they too could have looked away but didn't, then perhaps the truth at the center of it all would travel a little further, that the richest thing any of us ever build is not our bank account, but the way we choose to treat the people who carry our dreams on their tired feet. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.